Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Unfortunately, the lights are so bright, I actually can't see you, but I see people are coming in, so welcome. We're really looking forward to this session this afternoon with you. I'm Karen Wilson. I work with the OECD. I've been leading our work on impact investing and impact measurement inside OECD and also with external partners, and it's really a pleasure to be here. I'm based in Geneva, so nice to be able to go to such a great event like this at home. So I'm looking forward to introducing our panel. So I guess they're not going to come up until I do introduce them, so let me do that right away. So I'm really delighted to have here, first of all, Daniela Stoffel. She's the State Secretary for International Finance, Federation Department of Finance in Switzerland. Welcome, Daniela. Then we have Erg Gasser. He's the CEO of the Swiss Bankers Association. Erg, welcome. Then we also have Patrick de Combourg. He's the ANC chair and chair of the Project Task Force on European Sustainability Reporting Standards. Patrick, you have the longest title. And then we're delighted that Clara Barbie, although she's based in the UK and she wasn't able to come in person, she is joining us by video conference somewhere. And she's the CEO of the Impact Management Project, and she's also been involved in the IFRS Foundation. Hi, Clara. Great to see you. So thank you so much for joining us virtually. So we're here for a very, very important topic this afternoon, and that is the issue of how greater transparency and disclosure can help increase impact. There have been huge changes in the landscape in impact measurement and reporting and disclosure over the last few months, but over the last couple of years, but particularly in the last few months. So this is a really, really timely discussion to have about this very important topic. So we're planning to have a very interactive panel with the speakers here because we have a great lineup of experts. And so I just wanted to start. I'm going to have a Q&A with each of the speakers. And then we'll have a discussion on the panel, and then we'll open up for a Q&A with the audience, and hopefully they can turn the lights down so I can see you all. But welcome again for this discussion. So, Clara, why don't I start with you? Given your role as CEO of the Impact Management Project, as well as your recent work with the IFRS Foundation, can you provide us with an overview of the progress on both impact management and reporting? You know, certainly there's been a lot of talk about reporting with the recent announcements, but also we know that impact management is so important because without that you actually can't report anything. And you've been deeply involved in both. Could you tell us a bit more about what's happening on the international landscape in this regard? Thank you.
Absolutely, Karen. And as you said, it's been a critical even month if we look at what's happened just in this last month. But as you know as well, there was a backstory. There's a lot that's been happening even in the last few years that I think has led up to this moment. So I am going to focus my comments on the international, as Karen said, and I suppose it's worth stating the obvious at the beginning, which is the reason why international as a conversation has been so important is because company value chains and investor portfolios, but also many sustainability issues are global in nature. And so I think as a basic truth anyway, a lot of us have been working on the assumption that we should strive for international consistency for optimal decision making wherever we can. And so if I just start with disclosure progress, and then I'll come to impact management, as Karen said, and talk about the link between the two. On the international front, it's been a really interesting and important year for disclosure progress in terms of international standards. And I think looking back at the beginning of this year, and actually even into last year, the IFRS Foundation, which obviously provides the accounting standards for over 140 jurisdictions, asked a really important question about whether it was needed to play a role when it came to sustainability information. And it is a demand-led organization, so it asked that question with humility and looked to see what people said. And I think what was heard was clearly investors and companies are calling for international standards wherever possible because of that basic truth I started with. But where I think it's fair to say jurisdictions found a place of agreement over the course of this year was that it is in the interests at a government level to aim for what has now been called a global baseline of information that can meet the needs of investors. That seems to have been the territory, Karen, that jurisdictions, at least if you look at the G20 communique, but then there's other jurisdictions outside the G20 that have also given this message. That seems to be the territory that jurisdictions are willing to say we need to at least aim for a global baseline in that area. And so that's what the IFRS has responded to as it set up its international sustainability related standards board. And it will be looking to meet the needs of investors in that area from now on. Now, to counter impact management, as you said, which is the starting point for everything, the way I think about what this ISSB will do is it will produce standards that are globally consistent that jurisdictions can then choose to bring in to their local law. It certainly shouldn't hold jurisdictions back. It's the floor, not the ceiling. But the optimal idea is that jurisdictions can build those standards in and then go further to meet needs of local laws or indeed broader reporting requirements that they have. And if that happens, Karen, then there will, I think, be unleashed a huge incentive for companies to improve their sustainability performance, knowing that at the least investors are pricing that information in. And so that's where you come to impact management, and that's the link, because although we're seeing huge progress on convergence of disclosure standards, where we need further convergence is on the principal standards, guidance, and resources that companies and investors have to improve their sustainability. Disclosure standards don't provide that. We need a broader set of tools for companies and investors to improve. And so I will close my comments by saying that the other really significant development internationally has been the launch, just in these last few weeks, of the impact management platform, which is steered by multilaterals, the OECD, UN agencies, and the IFC, and is aiming to foster convergence among that broader set of standards. And I think there's a nice link between the two I'll close on, which is that the multilaterals are also playing a key role advising the new board of the IFRS. And so my hope is that on the international stage, we've now got these two really strong centers of gravity.
Great. Thank you so much, Clara. As you said, convergence is important, and also coherence. And that's really one of the key things also with the impact management platform that was just launched, as you mentioned, that is really helping to explain how existing standards, frameworks, principles can be used by investors and companies to sort of get away from these excuses. Well, there's so many frameworks, we don't know where to start. Well, actually, you can start by going to the impact management platform and looking at the different actions and finding the appropriate ones to use based on what's already there. And really, thank you, Clara, to your leadership and the leadership of the team in helping to get the impact management platform where it is today. There'll be a workshop on Wednesday for people that are interested in learning more about that. But I want to stay with you for a minute. Unfortunately, Nathan from PRI couldn't join us for the same reason. Unfortunate, COVID is interfering still with our plans. So I wanted to ask you one of the things I would have asked him, knowing that you've worked very closely with practitioners over the years. What are you seeing in terms of the change in their not only mindset, but also their behavior in terms of impact management?
So there's a couple of different things, Karen. One is that I think, and you'll see this in the platform that we've both referenced, the conversation is no longer about just metrics. It's also about what is my governance? What is good governance that I'm putting in place to ensure I'm improving my sustainability? It's about good strategy. It's about good risk management. And then once you've also got performance on metrics, it's about putting that information in context relative to social and ecological thresholds, for example, to determine whether it's negative or positive. And it's that whole cycle, Karen, which I think is now becoming much clearer, both for companies and for investors, and is leading to a much richer practice that is frankly just much more meaningful. A second trend is that I think we are now seeing a shift from what has been often a backward-looking conversation to forward-looking, and increasing comfort with that. You know, I've had many conversations with CFOs who are understandably very nervous about forward-looking information. But when you get under the hood and into the conversation about, well, actually, we do use forward-looking information already, and actually, we can talk about scenarios, we can talk about ranges. We don't have to talk about a specific forecast that you will then be legally held accountable to. It is actually meaningful enough to give information about ranges and what you expect and how you might react to different scenarios. And then you get into a conversation, Karen, where I think people are much more comfortable. So the backward to forward is another really important shift. And the final one is integration. Historically, when you look at the teams within companies and financial institutions, very often you have had the finance team, the investment team, and then a sustainability team or an impact team, often sitting in different places in an office. We are now seeing integration of teams and a recognition of the interdependencies between social, environmental, economic, and financial. And I think that is only going to get sharper. And it makes me much more optimistic that we will see integrated decisions happening in the boardroom.
And that integration is so important. It used to be that sustainability was really something that was done in a corner by one or two people, but now it's really become central to management and to strategy, a really, really important shift. Also, as you said, there are many steps to impact management, and that needs to happen before anything can be reported. And though everyone's talking about reporting, there is mandatory reporting, but there's also voluntary. So there are many companies and investors that choose to report things because they believe it's the right thing to do beyond what's mandatory. So I hope in the panel we can talk about both and not just mandatory reporting. Thank you, Clara. I'll come back to you again a little bit later. So now I'll turn to Patrick. Given your role with the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group, EFRAG, can you explain how Europe is progressing in terms of reporting requirements, both voluntary and regulatory, and what are some of the next steps in place for implementation? I mean, clearly Europe has been on the forefront, very active, a lot happening, so please.
Thank you, Karen. Yes, I think that the key point is that Europe has decided to tackle to get out of the what people call the alphabet soup of sustainability reporting. So many frameworks, some standards, but at the end of the day, a lack of reliable and relevant ESG data. So in the context of many EU policies that are dedicated to sustainable development, sustainable finance, and other initiatives, it was felt that it was necessary to address the question of relevant, comparable, and reliable data. So therefore, the EU has taken two initiatives. The first one is to develop a new legal framework, a directive, which is called the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which was adopted by the Commission in April 2021, following an elaboration process, and that is now following the legislative process in the EU, Parliament, Council, etc., and which is due to be fully adopted, we think, at the end of the first half of 2022, towards the end of the first half of 2022. So what are the key features of the CSRD? So that's the first level. It is to create a mandatory regime for all large entities in the EU. Large means, in EU language, you know, a certain number of criteria, but if I am only mentioning the number of employees, it's entities over and above 250 employees. So it's a rather low threshold. We're talking about 50,000 entities representing more than 50% of the EU GDP. So it is a serious move forward. on the basis of a full comprehensive coverage of ESG matters involving planet, people, and governance, ESG, promoting audit as a key feature, one location, the management report. At EFRAG, we are developing the concept of sustainability statements. That would be a specific section of the management report, which would be the other leg of corporate standardized reporting, together with it as a counterpart of financial statements and in connectivity with the financial statements. And also, I forgot to mention, but SMEs, so below the threshold, would be encouraged to adopt a simplified system because they are also in the ESG domain extremely important because they need financing, they have to report to financial institutions, they may have shareholders in public with the public listing. They can also move to the public listing. They are also partners with large entities in their supply chains. So that's the overall system. So that's the first point. The second point is that from the start, so almost 2 years ago, the Commission said we need principles which are of a legal nature, but we also need robust standards. And that's what EFRAG is developing as we speak. I forgot to mention that there is a pretty strict timeline, which is, by the way, which is discussed at political level today. Maybe there will be some leeway, but at the moment, what is in the CSRD is that this mandatory regime would have to be operational, would have to be implemented in 2024, early 2024, with a reference to reporting year 2023. So basically, it's tomorrow. But it's also urgent because many companies are requested to fill an exponential number of questionnaires from investor rating agencies, NGOs, and we need to stabilize the platform for reporting and start from there and make it, by the way, accessible to everybody as a public good. So EFRAG at the moment is working on the development of those standards that we need to deliver as a first set of standards, because there will be several. So a first game-changing step, but nevertheless a consolidation step by the end of 2022. And we need to deliver that mid-2022 for adoption via delegated acts. By comparison to the directive, which has to be transposed, the standards would be adopted by delegated acts, and delegated acts in the EU are applicable throughout the EU without transposition. So that's also a game-changing step because that creates, an overall system. So that's moving forward, and I would like to say a word about, international initiatives, because you mentioned the fact, and I think it's true, that the EU somehow in a front-running position, but we don't want to be alone, and we certainly want to consider the global progress of sustainability reporting. So we have what we call a co-construction spirit. So we are eager we have the extended hand policy to other initiatives, and we want to build on and contribute to global progress. So that's, of course, not easy because we do not have the same timelines. We might not have exactly the same coverage, at least to start with. So, but nevertheless, there are open lines of communication with, for instance, the Global Reporting Initiative, with which we have signed a cooperation agreement, with Shift, with Wiki, and also we have regular conversations with the IFRS Foundation, which established a technical readiness working group, and Clara knows very well that she was extremely instrumental in this, and with SASB, which is now joining, effective June 2022, the ISSB slash IFRS Foundation initiative. So we had, I don't know how many discussions, not always easy because, you know, different paces and different coverage to start with. Nevertheless, a willingness to combine the EU objectives with the upcoming baseline which was mentioned, and building blocks. You know, that's so that's the overall situation in the EU.
Thank you. And obviously, collaboration in this space is so critical. There are so many great initiatives, whether we're talking about impact management or we're talking about reporting and disclosure. And the more these different efforts can work together and collaborate, I think the better off everyone is. And this gets to the point that Clara was making about convergence. You know, we'll need more convergence over time. But there's a lot happening, there's a lot of movement, and for those that aren't used to working with policymakers, and I can say this from my experience with OECD, policy is usually not the fastest to move, but I have to say, between the quick movement within the EU, the great work of the IFRS Foundation, and many, many others, I mean, I've never seen so much speed on this topic as we've seen over the last couple of years.
There is momentum, and I would say that sustainability reporting is becoming mainstream. I used to say that corporate reporting has to walk on two legs: financial reporting, which is pretty mature and stable, and sustainability reporting needs to emerge fast and get similar status. I forgot to mention one point, if I may, Karen, because sometimes there is two schools of thought. Some are talking about financial materiality, what is the risk and opportunities for the reporting entity, and others mention impact materiality. And the EU, by the way, is making a clear reference to what we call double materiality. So it's both. It's at one and the same time what I would call the outside in, risks and opportunities. So risks for the financial performance of the entity, the investor focus to a certain extent, though investors have a broader spectrum of concerns, and the inside-out relationships with society and environment, which we call the impact in our language. But I don't see that as it is a difference, but it's not a major obstacle, and certainly not a stumbling block, because under double materiality, you certainly include financial materiality. So I just wanted to make that clear for the audience, because that's something that is sometimes misunderstood.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. Materiality is certainly at the core of these discussions, because different companies and investors have different views on materiality. And some are really looking at enterprise value, and others are looking at broader impacts in addition. And we know that materiality is dynamic. It's changing over time. So how can we make sure that that companies and investors are keeping an eye on how things that are material beyond what's currently financially material are changing, and how and when they need to take these into account. So it's a moving space. It's not a clear line. It's a dotted line, really. And that's why all of this work is so important, to really help investors and companies understand, depending on their view of materiality, what kind of tools.
By the way, in the title of this session, we should increase positive impacts, not impacts when they are negative.
Yes, exactly. So I was going to come back to that in the Q&A, but we will come back to that in a minute. So let me move on right now to Erg. Given your role as CEO of the Swiss Bankers Association, can you share your views on how companies and investors are adapting impact measurement, transporting, and reporting practices? And how has the growth of sustainable finance in Switzerland, we know that Switzerland is really one of the leading countries in sustainable finance, how is that changing mindsets, and what will it take to really progress further?
Well, it's not just that we want to be a leading financial center in sustainable finance. We in fact, we are, since Switzerland, especially here in Geneva, sustainable finance, impact finance, and microfinance has found its roots here already in the 80s. Of course, at that time, I remember, somebody cited Schopenhauer this morning. At that time, these people who were really looking into environment and sustainability in the financial sectors, they're often called tree huggers, as it has been mentioned this morning. But it happened in the 80s already. And of course, the market at that time was rather small, so it didn't really fly. And what I want to say with that is that the tradition in Switzerland with regard to sustainability is deeply rooted into society, in the financial sector as well as in academy. And I think this is one of the comparative advantages that we have here in Switzerland. We have a very broad and large financial sector. The financial sector is able to develop and to market products that are very, very wide-ranging. And on top of that, we have the knowledge with the highest densities of universities here in Switzerland, which makes us really the core or the ideal place to develop sustainable finance. And as we see here, building bridges it's not by chance that building bridges is here in Geneva, not only because the United Nations is here, but also Geneva as well as Zurich, of course, has a long tradition in that. Now, what I see when sustainable finance popped up a few years ago and became really mainstream is that there are many concepts and ideas floating around. And that, of course, makes it very difficult for the financial sector to adapt accordingly, because you need a methodology, ideally a globally accepted methodology, how to measure impact, and that is on its way, as we have heard. The European Union is currently working on it. Swiss government is working on it, and of course, this is the baseline. We need a methodology according to which impact can be measured. In order to make to give a certain direction where impact measuring should go, because this is the baseline for all. But it has also been mentioned this morning, the financial sector can only help, but it cannot do it by itself. So in order to measure impact, you need to be able to find the whole, or to identify the whole chain of production with regards to what impact it makes, in order to be able to measure the impact of a financial product, which always mirrors the real economy. And from that point of view, I think it is slowly, the fog is slowly lifting, in the sense that here in Switzerland, we strongly believe that one of the possibilities, or one of the most promising methodology is the Science-Based Target Initiative, which is currently to be implemented by many institutes, and also is promoted by the Swiss banking industry, Swiss Banking Association. But what really counts is the fact that the banks are starting, and have already started, to develop their own methodology. And it doesn't matter so much what kind of methodology you have. What is important is that you get a framework in which shows what kind of criteria these impact measuring methods need to fulfill. And I think this is what we need. I can very much imagine that there are different standards measuring impact, but also transparency, as long as they are fulfilling certain criteria. And these criteria are about to be developed, as we have heard from the Federal Council, Maurer, this morning, which will very much streamline and also very much speed up the development of these kind of methodology, because as we also heard this morning, we are slowly running out of time. So there is a much going on with regard to impact measurement, with regards to transparency. TCFD has not been mentioned yet, but that's a very important standard that is applied widely, not only in Switzerland, but globally. It seems to, at least we have the impression that this is one of the global standards that that will make the race, if you can say so. So from that point of view, there are many things are going on, and what we need is a framework of methodology in which we are able to calibrate these different approaches to measure impact. And this is underway. The question is only, does it happen fast enough?
Great, thank you. And that goes back to some of the things Clara had mentioned, also about thresholds when you talked about science-based targets, and also the fact that there are a lot of different frameworks and principles and tools out there. And actually that's okay, because you use different ones at different steps in the process, but helping to guide companies and investors to the right ones at the right time is what can perhaps make a difference at this stage in the game, which gets back to the impact management platform that Clara mentioned. We started with Patrick to talk about positive and negative impacts. How are the banks thinking about minimizing negative risks and maximizing positive risks? How do they think about, there's some people that put ESG in one camp and impact in another, and never the two shall meet. We see that, I have to say, within OECD, between the camps working on these different things. How are your constituents thinking about this?
Well, we believe that in this regard we need a holistic approach. First of all, it is something that the client wants, so there is not much choice in doing otherwise. And second of all, from an impact point of view, what you need to have as a client is to know where you stand with your product that you would like to buy, with regards to sustainability, of course. And if you are able to produce for your clients a score that shows you where you stand on your path towards sustainability, then I think you're on the right track, and that's exactly what the banks try to develop currently in order to respond to the client needs and also to the investors' needs with regards to categorizing their products they would like to buy or they would like to invest in.
And have you seen, so we've mentioned a lot of the momentum and a lot of the talk around reporting and impact management. Are you seeing it actually being applied? Have you seen a real step change in terms of how people are actually making investments in this area?
Definitely. I think especially, it all has also been mentioned this morning, we have an exponential growth with regards to everything that is somehow labeled sustainability. Of course, that raises the question with regard to greenwashing, but maybe we do not go down this tunnel.
We'll come to it later.
We'll come to that later. But anyway, it shows clearly that everybody and every institute is geared towards sustainability. That wasn't the case at all a few years ago. If I think back to 2015, 2016, when we started to talk about sustainability in a serious way, of course, there were some voices who were not at all in favor of it and thought that it's just something that will disappear soon. This is definitely not the case anymore. Everything and everybody is investing heavily in that, not only and I think it's very correct what has been said with regard to financial reporting. Sustainable reporting will be as important as financial reporting in the very near future.
Great, so that bridge is already more than halfway built, is that?
I would say so. We're not in a tunnel. We are building a bridge, indeed.
Fantastic. Great, we need that here in Geneva. Another one.
Yes, across the
Or a tunnel, yes, exactly. So Daniela, where does Switzerland stand in terms of reporting regulation? And how can Switzerland align internationally and to EU standards? How is Switzerland thinking about this? And how proactive do you expect Switzerland to be in this regard, given the important role that the country is playing in sustainable finance, as we heard throughout the day and repeated just now?
Yes, I was very pleased to hear that standards will be designed such that jurisdictions can adapt them, that it is, we see, as was said, we see many standards, many methods, and we're convinced they're going to converge. They have to. we do hope, or we think, important work will also be done by the multilateral institutions, especially the FSB, and also some work will be done at the OECD, sort of supporting that work. What we are not going to do in Switzerland is prescribing a certain standard. We are, as was also mentioned before, we are going to rate the methods. We're going to give an indication to our financial market intermediaries what standard makes the cut and what standard doesn't, or we will sort of create criteria around the quality of standards and methods, and but we will not prescribe or regulate in the sense that it is each and every actor's own choice if they want to be in the crowd or out of the crowd. And I think when it comes to double materiality, we are maybe even looking at triple materiality. We are certainly recommending currently alignment standards, forward-looking, but we are not sort of putting a stop at the moment when you say, okay, this is a 2-degree portfolio. This is just then out there. And if you then as an investor or an advisor come and say, okay, there is a potential, or a 5-degree portfolio, there is potential, and who knows who is going to the decision maker, you know? Is it going to be the shareholders? Is it going to be a big investor? Is it going to be the general public or the policymakers who suddenly find majorities to build more framework conditions to sort of bring in the markets around a certain goal, climate goal? If you bet on the future, and I think this is what also partially answers the question Jörg was just answering, we see this as the chance, as the option and the future. It is not you have to force your customers into there as a bank. What we do as a regulator, we create the possibilities for them to go there, where we think we're at a tipping point where we are going to go, where we have to go. So this is what we're trying to create. And of course, it will be paramount that we will have globally converging standards, that they are comparable, that certainly standards are not used to fragment markets. This is too much or too important a goal to achieve. And this is where we currently are. So no compulsory regulation from our side currently. We believe in the markets. We support the markets where they need supporting. And the rest is really a common bet on our common future.
Thank you. And we heard earlier about SMEs versus larger companies. How do you think about that in Switzerland in terms of what is appropriate for SMEs to be able to do versus the larger companies?
Yes, absolutely. There is always the question of how burdensome is such a reporting that will inevitably happen for smaller companies. How easy will it be for them to use data, to use a standard, work it into their accounting? Currently, the TCFD that we're going to make compulsory for bigger companies has several criteria. One of them is 500 or more employees. So the discussion for the smaller companies will have to center around, it needs to be feasible. It maybe needs to use a standard that has already proven its worth in terms of not much bureaucracy, ease of doing business, maybe also a tech solution. That would be the best. We are very interested in supporting fintech solutions in that area. The cost benefit should be worth it for the smaller companies.
Thank you. And clearly technology is going to play a huge role. It already is in impact management and measurement, and will play a really, really important role going forward. You mentioned the role of multilaterals, so maybe I'll come back to Clara. Clara, I know with the IFRS Foundation, in addition to the other working group, you were also overseeing the working group with the multilateral organizations. Can you say a bit more about the role that multilaterals play in this landscape, more broadly?
Yeah, Karen, I mean, going to my initial
We're having a bit of a connection problem. Clara? Okay, we'll come back to you. You've frozen for the moment, but we'll come back to you in a minute. I think you're back. Do you want to try again? No, she's not moving. Okay. All right, she'll be with us again in a minute. So a lot of, we talked about measurement and data, and being from OECD, of course, I love data, like all my colleagues. But you know, a lot of the data and standards and frameworks so far have been focusing on climate, very understandably. How can we make progress not only on climate, which is important, but also on the broader environmental issues as well as social issues? And of course, gender is a big topic here, well, globally, but also for Building Bridges Week and diversity more broadly. So how can we progress on some of these? Patrick, I see you have the microphone.
No, just to say, I already mentioned that under the EU system which is currently being developed, there is a comprehensive coverage of sustainability matters. And we are producing, as we speak, working papers that are the preliminary content of the standard on a number of topics. We issued one on climate back in September. We are going to revise this working paper because we also had the opportunity to see the one that was that has been produced by the IFRS Foundation and which has made publicly available in the context of COP26. We had a side event on our side. I should open a parenthesis here to say that you mentioned TCFD. Due to the common TCFD inspiration, I see a good compatibility between the two. So convergence in that wouldn't be in that area wouldn't be a big problem. We are covering also the other environmental topics such as water, pollution, circular economy, and biodiversity. Of course, for biodiversity, we will be carefully monitoring the work of the TNFD, which has just been established. But that's the E side, the planet side. On the social side, we are working also on, you know, a first set of standards on the workforce, on supply chain, on affected communities, and also on end users of products and services, since sustainable products and sustainable services are also a key element of sustainable development. And finally, we are working on governance, but governance in the broad sense, including the governance per se, but the management of relationships. Because, you know, if I may, the approach that we have fostered in our preliminary report, which is available on the EFRAG website and which dates back to early March, we said we have to address planet, that's E, we have to address people, that's S, and we have to address the intangible aspect which is creating value and positive impacts, which is the moral person, what the moral person brings when combining all the elements. That's why we are covering innovation, relationships, and brand also.
So, Erg, if I can come back to you, how are financial products integrating some of these sustainability factors, again, that go beyond climate, which is more measurable, into the broader E and into the S? And you know, how far developed are some of these products? It's hard to structure them in a way that investors will actually come in.
Well, I mean, I think everybody would agree if I said that what regards E, the most progress has been made because that's the most urgent issue. GHG emission is the one pressing issue for the time being. So it doesn't surprise that most efforts went into this, and I think it's correctly so. Now, with regard to biodiversity, circular economy, well, that's a whole different topic, and all it depends on data. We simply do not have the data in order to include, for example, biodiversity issues into financial products for the time being on a large scale. Of course, this is about to be being developed, but we are far from really being able to produce accurate data on how the planet's biodiversity improves via certain financial products. Of course, you have this, but you don't have it on a massive scale for the time being. And as long as we are not able to produce the necessary data, and this is exactly the area where sustainability meets digitization, as long as we don't have this kind of data, and we will have it very soon in view of the fact that big data and digitalization is really taking up speed as well, as long as we do not have this kind of robust data, which gives an overview of the biodiversity, which is extremely complex mechanism that nobody understands for the time being. We are simply not able to develop these kind of products on a large scale. So from that point of view, the answer is clear. We advance on the E side. We do not that much, and only on the climate side, and we do not develop very fast on the rest what concerns the E. And similar to social and governance. I mean, there are many efforts underway, but of course, again, if you are not able to have a reliable set of data, it's very difficult to develop products in accordance to data that is robust enough.
But as you say, there's a lot of work underway, and I know that my colleagues at OECD have been doing a lot of work on biodiversity. They submitted a paper to the G7, working hard on data, on broader E and on S, and many other organizations too. But we still have a ways to go also to have comparable data. But
we have a long way to go, but one should not forget it's not the financial sector that solves the problem. I mean, as I said at the beginning, the financial sector is mirroring the real economy. It's the real economy that really will produce the impact. And the banking or the financial sector can accompany, can measure, can bring in the data, the know-how, how to do it if we talk about transition, for example. But it cannot be done by the financial sector itself. It needs the collaboration between the real economy and the financial sector, and that's why we're all sitting here and trying to build some bridges, not only towards the UN and across the lake, but also into the real economy.
Absolutely, and also with the public sector. Which comes back to my question for Clara. We'll give it another try about the role that multilaterals can play in this process.
Great, thank you, Karen. I think actually the previous speakers teed this up nicely because to the point on data, I'll start with that. One of the reasons that I was really excited to see both the IFRS new board acknowledge the importance of being advised by the multilaterals and others, but the permanent seats are multilaterals, but also the impact management platform that's just launched, having the steering committee of multilaterals, is because there is a recognition that the data challenge will be partly addressed by the roles of the multilaterals who have, I think, a huge amount of wealth of data between them that is extraordinarily relevant for companies and investors making better decisions. And actually one of the things, Karen, that happened at the launch of the impact management platform is that UNDESA joined as well as the UN agency responsible for the SDGs and a lot of the statistical work. And I have just been very encouraged that at least that conversation is now moving, and there is certainly a digital angle to it as well. The other thing that I think is really important about multilaterals is that I would guess, and Karen, you can correct me on this one, but from what I've observed, multilateral organizations understand inherently that there are very fuzzy edges between sustainability issues, largely because you are working with governments across many of them at the same time. And something that came out of the technical readiness working group that Patrick mentioned, that the IFRS has been running, and I'll briefly tell you to give you some confidence in alphabet soup, that group comprised TCFD, the VRF, which is the IIRC and SASB, the CDSP and the WEF, the World Economic Forum's effort in this area, that whole group came together to do the technical readiness work for the new IFRS board. And one of the things that came out of it, which perhaps people won't have seen, so I encourage you to look at it, is actually a prototype alongside a climate prototype that is what's called general requirements. And it says to companies, you know, here is how you can disclose any material sustainability information that is relevant for investors, and it provides a structure for doing that. And it's important, Karen, symbolically, because it is an acknowledgement right out the gate from the IFRS that this is not a conversation limited to climate, and that what we need is companies to be disclosing the breadth of information that we need for optimal decisions.
Thank you, Clara. And I should have warned the audience in advance. In this space, we love acronyms, so we can decode all the acronyms afterwards. We should have provided a glossary with this session, probably. Daniela, I wanted to come back to you on the role of policymakers and regulators and practitioners. You know, standard setting takes two to tango in many ways. Can you reflect in Switzerland on that process, and maybe if you want to pick up on the earlier discussion on going beyond climate?
Yeah, maybe first the second question. With S&G, we're very fast in the realm of values, and you mentioned the moral individual. I don't think we can go back to the Enlightenment and pretend we're all singularly morally motivated beings. It might just do the trick to be completely transparent, you know. You don't have to judge, but if you have all the information on a product, you know, this involves child labor, this involves thousands of kilometers of transportation, this was produced by a financial institution that employs 10% women. So you can judge, or you can sort of buy according to your own values, or you can then sort of find risks in there because you think, oh gosh, if there are no women there, how good can it be? So I think transparency goes a very long way in S&G. And this is even more difficult to find the data and to, you know, use them in a way that's meaningful for the consumer or the producer. How do we go about finding solutions or defining the conditions, the framework conditions that we use in Switzerland? It was said we have a very long tradition in sustainability. You could argue that our political system is sort of a result of that we're very confined as a small society without natural resources. So we do it by talking to each other. We're so small. Not everybody knows everybody, but you're only always 1 or 2 phone calls away. So it is a dialogue, and it is, of course, in the end, you know, if it's a regulation, then it is the executive that proposes something to Parliament. But it is a lengthy discussion, and our direct democracy, I think, is sort of the last step of finding majority for solutions that have been diligently built, widely discussed, and are then sort of ready for a consensus. This is how we do it.
Great. That's why we all live in Switzerland. So I realized that time is ticking, and I had promised a Q&A with the audience. So I will try to do that now, but if someone can help me, because I can't see the audience with the lights. So someone has a microphone here. There we go. Thank you. Wow, there are people here. That's great. So I'll take a bunch of questions together because we don't have a lot of time for the answers, but hopefully the speakers will be here to talk to you afterwards. And then I'll ask each speaker to address the questions most relevant to them, and then also to give their recommendation for what really needs to happen next to move this dialogue, not just dialogue, but implementation forward on these really important issues. Okay, so if you can help me with hands, since it's still a bit hard to see. So, anyone? Any brave souls? Yeah, okay. And just briefly introduce yourself and ask a short question, please. Thank you.
Sure, it's going to be short. Jan from Tribe Impact Capital. thank you very much for the presentation. And just have a quick question / remark, and maybe you can help me to address that. 10 years ago, when I finished my studies, we were also talking about the lack of transparency and the lack of available data on the sustainability side. 10 years down the road, I've been working in this industry for 8 years now, and I've seen this data improving, transparency improving, more tools. We talked this morning about ITR, all the carbon disclosing must be much better now. So why are we still talking about the lack of common framework of data? Is there a way for financial industry to just wait a bit more longer, or just to hide behind something? It'd be interesting to know a bit more about that.
Great, thank you. Very important question. Let's see if someone can define short. The next question, short question for the audience. Again, if you can help me with the microphone, it's hard to see. It's a shame I can't see you all, because I love to cold call people I know in the audience, so you're safe today.
Well, good afternoon, Karen. It's Bruno Roche here from Economics of Materiality. Just a quick question for the audience. You talked a lot about the Western side of accounting. So I'd like to, maybe you could elaborate on what particularly the Chinese are thinking about this philosophy of single versus double materiality.
Great, thanks, Bruno. Okay, then unless there's another quick question, there's one over there.
This is Heiko Behler from RepRisk Zurich. ISSB is supposedly streamlining some standards like TFCD, SFDR, SASB, potentially. I mean, SFDR, I'm not sure, but some of these standards into a more common framework. And I'm curious, it was well received by the G20 ministers, but how mandatory is that likely to become and when?
Okay, so why don't we leave it there, because I know we're running out of time. And so if I can, Clara, could I start with you, given the last question? And if you want to answer that and address any of the others, that would be great. And then perhaps give your thoughts on what needs to happen next, your sort of closing recommendation. And then we'll go to the others. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, I can't speak on behalf of jurisdictions in terms of when such standards might be mandatory. To the last speaker's question, I can give some positive indications that are already being heard. For example, the UK government just in October released its strategy, which said that the standards issued by the ISSB will form the backbone of their disclosure requirements. And I guess to go to your question on China, for example, you know, in the G20 discussions, the Chinese Ministry of Finance was supportive of the direction that the IFRS is taking in this area. So I think if you then look at TCFD, and I noted that one of my colleagues on the panel talked about that being, you know, one of the front runners in the race for global standards. I think what TCFD's secretariat would say is TCFD isn't a standard. It's a set of recommendations, and really well received recommendations. And actually the architecture of those recommendations have guided the IFRS's preparation work in this area. So expect to see that architecture, I think, coming through. But what governments are saying is, well, we need an assurable version of TCFD. And I say that to you because I think we can be encouraged where you've seen jurisdictions already move and say, we're embracing the TCFD recommendations in terms of a path to mandatory. You know, if the ISSB produces an assurable version of TCFD, it would be very natural for that then in due course to take its place.
Great.
And Karen, I guess if I'm allowed to close with a comment on what I think needs to happen, I think that we need to be really careful not to think there's one silver bullet to solve all of this. If you look at our financial markets as they've historically been, we've never said that you should collapse the financial statements into credit ratings, into good governance practices, for example. Those are different tools that we need, and what we want is that they're all coherent. And I think when it comes to this area, we need to have the same kind of conversation. Where is it that we genuinely need convergence? And there's no question that at the international stage, the ISSB has done a really good job so far in signaling convergence, because you've got organizations actually folding into it. which is very powerful. And we did need convergence in that area. But there are also areas where we don't need convergence, we need coherence. And so I think this platform that both you and I have mentioned is a key place for practitioners because it can explain that coherence by the organizations that actually produce those international standards.
Great. Thanks, Clara. Who would like to go next?
I'm happy if you would. Okay, thank you. No, a quick reaction on the first question. How can we be sure that 5 years down the road we are not asking ourselves the same question about, the quality of ESG data? I think it's a combination of, consolidation of standards and creating a compatible environment, which is easier, by the way, in a digital environment, because, there is a tool called tagging, where you take a granular information and you put a tag. You can tag it as a EU required disclosure, but you could tag it also as an IFRS disclosure and a SASB one and a TCFD one. So you can have multiple taggings. So in a machine-readable environment, I think you can create a lot more compatibility because, of course, a text is a text, and you are bound to read chapter 1 after before chapter 2, etc. When, in fact, in the digital. Okay, so factor 1 is consolidation and compatibility in standard setting. Factor 2 is, of course, market pressure, so that a cultural evolution, in particular, under the sustainable finance effort, but careful with the ESG washing. So which is, for me, one of the big risks, because, many products are going to be sold, but if they are related to reliable data, that's fine. If the data is so-so, then we will have frustrations and disappointments. And the third factor, at the end of the day, is regulation creating a mandatory regime. Because can we think, if we want sustainability reporting to become, the other leg of corporate reporting, I submit the question to all of us. Could we imagine financial reporting without a mandatory regime? Could we leave it to the entity to decide if they are going to produce a balance sheet or not, and if it's going to be audited or not? Where would be the financial markets if we were in such a position? So I would like to transpose that observation to the sustainability reporting. So the third factor, in order to make sure that we succeed, is to take care of the third factor, if I may say so.
Yeah, and if I could just build on that briefly. Financial accounting was developed, 100 or more years ago. It wasn't perfect, it's still not perfect, but we've evolved it over time. So same for sustainability reporting. There's been a lot of progress. I mean, really the discussion we're having here today is wildly different than the discussion even a year ago. There's so much happening, there's been a lot of progress, and there's more to come. I think it's not just talk, there's really action on many fronts in the market, Karen, on the policy side.
My only observation would be that if it took centuries to develop financial reporting, but also there was an acceleration in the last 20 years or 30 years with the worldwide financial markets, we don't have that time for sustainability reporting.
We don't.
We don't.
Yes,
so
yes.
we are running against the clock somehow. And, so it's absolutely important if we want to tackle the challenges we have in front of us, climate, but also other key challenges, social ones, data privacy, etc. We need to go to faster. So, so we need to combine the front runners and the ones that are maybe catching up with the front runners. That's a combination of efforts. Baseline is fine, but also more advanced systems are fine. And the sooner they become mandatory, the better, in my view.
Yeah, and the point of urgency is really, really important. And the only reason why I mentioned financial accounting in the centuries is that it doesn't have to be perfect. And that gets to voluntary reporting initially, where maybe things aren't perfect, but at least we get started, and then things evolve over time. Daniela, I wanted to come back to you as well to answer some of the questions from the audience and also to give your recommendation for what needs to happen next.
Yes, maybe the data question. It is indeed paramount to have the data, and I don't think anybody is trying to hide behind not having data. It is, as was said, a question of, do we have the data in the right format? How reliable are they? Are they accessible? We have many data in Switzerland that are not accessible. An example I'm going to give you is tax information. We would love to have at national level more information from cantons for different sorts of analysis, not for revenue purposes, but we don't. So this is maybe a rather weak point in Switzerland. Then I think there was a question regarding China. Well, China as a G20 subscribes to the communiques that are published, and they use important language. And not naming names, but it is not China that is opposed to sustainable finance or sustainability language in the communiques. Of course, this comes back to the question, where is impact easiest, cheapest, so to say, most scalable, and it is, of course, in bigger economies. But this is maybe a discussion that's not closely related to the standards. It's more about the financing of the transition.
And what about this question of impact washing and ESG washing? I guess you addressed it a bit earlier when you were talking about ratings and
yes.
things.
Here, our experience is that a clear legal framework is actually a strength, and it is a protection for those who act in the markets. And we are also looking at ways and means to address the issue, to bring more clarity, to help financial market actors avoid mistakes. And where this can be done, we will look into this over the course of this year and come out, especially, it was said, there are different kinds of risks and problems. There might be just financial risks or adaptation risks in portfolios. And then on the other hand, there is wrong labeling of impact of ESG content. These are different issues. And where we can create comfort by being clearer and creating a concrete set of rules, we will do that. But it is not in the sense, as was suggested, that we force the markets into a standard that where we think it still makes a lot of sense if the market can choose.
Great, thank you. Erg, I'd like to come to you for your thoughts on some of the questions and closing remarks.
Just one little thing to add, maybe, it's with regard to how mandatory do standards need to become in the near future. I'm not sure if standards need to be mandatory. I think what needs to be clear is against which criteria these standards are to be developed, and the criteria need to be clear in order to have a standard at the end, a standard that can be considered as sustainable. And we should work on the criteria that need to be fulfilled. And from my point of view, there is no reason why there should not be a certain competition with regard to standards that meet certain criteria. Some standards may then go beyond the criteria that are set out by the government or by an international organization. And that could be a distinguishing or a unique selling proposition of that specific standard or the specific institute that uses the standard. But I would rather opt for having clear criteria that standards need to fulfill instead of having standards that are mandatory across the globe.
And that gets back to the title of the session, which is about transparency and disclosure. And so the importance of transparency also for impact management, to be clear how you're going about impact management and what you're disclosing and what's behind that. So we were given a few extra minutes, so if there are any other comments from the panel, I'm happy to take them. Patrick, I saw you, you were ready to come in. Please go ahead.
I just wanted to mention what the ultimate goal of transparency should be. You know, we're talking about disclosures. What are the intrinsic qualities of a good disclosure? I think I would like to offer this for discussion purposes or to take away. Financial reporting has developed a clear set of criteria for quality reporting. When you consider this, it's pretty similar to possibly the characteristics of quality that are required from sustainability disclosures. What are they? Relevance. An information need to be relevant. 2, disclosure should provide a faithful representation. So, in isolation and in aggregate, you need to offer a full depiction of the phenomenon you want to depict. 3, comparability. That's where market pressure and also entity-specific efforts are meeting their limits. Because, you know, they can have a number of ways to approach, and at a moment in time, it needs to be a convention. Market pressure can impose comparable reasons, comparable disclosures, but it's also why mandatory disclosures are useful if the standard setter is doing his job. Then you need to be understandable, because you can obscure, you know, instead of being transparent, you can be obscure, because you have too many information, and it's information overload. And finally, it has to be verifiable and reliable. So there is a track between the original data and the disclosure, which you can follow. It's called an audit track.
Great, thank you for that. That's a good place to end. A lot of very important points, and particularly the one about making sure that the information is decision-making relevant. A lot of people think that impact measurement and management is about coming up with big numbers and looking really good, or having so much data that you can impress people. But actually, it's about having relevant data to make good decisions. I was teaching last week in Paris, and my students were looking at different sustainability reports, and there was one company, I won't name, that had hundreds and hundreds of pages of data. But you get lost. I mean, what's the relevance of, you know, that they're trying to show that they're taking this seriously without actually providing decision-relevant information. Okay, we are running out of time. Clearly, we see that there's been a lot of progress in this space, but also there's a lot of opportunity ahead, which is really exciting for all of us here at the conference and here for Building Bridges Week. There's an urgency to move quickly. We don't have a lot of time to get this right, but there are a lot of really smart, experienced people that are working on this, including the people here this week. There'll be a lot of events during the week focused on these issues, so hope you can join those, and look forward to working with you all going forward. And a huge thanks to our excellent panel, and thank you, Clara, for joining us virtually.